The chalk line of the parapet was still black with morning damp when the Marines settled into position. It was the third week of March 1918, somewhere north of Verdun, in a sector of French trenches the Germans had not seriously contested in months. The 5th Regiment of Marines had moved into these lines days earlier, rotating battalion by battalion through a system built and bled over by the French for the better part of 2 years. The trench smelled of wet soil, rotting wood, and the particular sharpness of old cordite that seemed to have soaked into the earth itself. The fire step was a notch of packed clay and planking, worn smooth by thousands of boots before the first American set foot on it. The Marine lying prone on that step had come from Parris Island, South Carolina, where the standard was simple. Every man who wore the eagle, globe and anchor was a rifleman first. His rifle was a Model 1903 Springfield, chambered for the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, and mounted above the receiver was a 5-power Winchester A5 telescopic sight. The A5 was not the Army's rifle. The Army had issued its snipers the Warner and Swarzy prismatic scope, an offset-mounted 6-power instrument that weighed over 2 pounds and had earned a poor reputation among the men who used it. The Marines had come to France with their own solution. The story of how the Marines came to carry a different rifle than the Army is partly a story about marksmanship culture and partly about a German immigrant at a Philadelphia shooting range in the spring of 1917. But it begins well before either. The United States Marine Corps had treated rifle proficiency as a foundational discipline for over a decade before the Great War. Brigadier General William C. Harley had authored the Standard Marine Corps Marksmanship Manual, a pocket-sized guide called the U.S. Marine Corps Scorebook and Rifleman's Instructor, which became the basis for training not only within the Corps but later incorporated into Army manuals and those of Britain, Cuba and Haiti. By 1915, Parris Island, South Carolina, had been consolidated as the single East Coast recruit depot, and every Marine who passed through it was trained on the M1903 Springfield with a standards-based qualification system that graded them from marksman through sharpshooter to expert. By the time war was declared in April 1917, the Marines had accumulated considerable experience with the A5 mounted on match-grade M1903 Springfields. The combination was accurate enough for 1,000-yard competition. The question was how to produce enough of them for France. The Marine Corps contracted in the late spring of 1917 with a gunsmith named Adolf Niedner to drill, tap and mount 1,650 M1903 rifles with A5 scopes at his shop in Philadelphia. Niedner had built a reputation among competitive shooters, and his work with what became known as the Man-Niedner mount gave the A5 a firm, reliable base on the receiver ring. He completed 150 rifles before the contract ended abruptly. While at a local shooting range in front of witnesses, Niedner made statements expressing his desire for Germany to win the war and his hope that every man sent to France would be killed. 3 men heard him. They reported it. The Bureau of Investigation opened a case against him and Niedner was removed from the contract. He was never charged, but his involvement ended that same day. The Marines were left with 150 completed rifles and no gunsmith. Winchester Repeating Arms took over the remaining work, producing rifles the Army itself began to call the Marine Corps model in its procurement documents. By the fall of 1917, approximately 500 AOG 5-equipped M1903 Springfields had been completed and shipped to France with the 5th Marine Regiment. The Army, facing shortages of Warner and Swarzy scopes due to a lens supply problem, placed its own orders for the same Winchester-mounted configuration the following January. The Marine A5 weighed 10 ounces. It was mounted forward on the barrel with a ring and a rear base attached to the receiver, which kept it centered over the bore. The eye relief was approximately 2 inches. It had been tested to destruction on match ranges in the United States and found reliable. When Marines deployed to France with their target rifles, they were not improvising. They were taking the most accurate long-range shooting instrument in the American infantry and placing it in a war that rewarded exactly that precision. Germany had a 3-year advantage. By the time the 5th Marines set foot on French soil in June 1917, German snipers had been systematically killing Allied soldiers since the autumn of 1914. The process had begun with improvisation. When the Western Front solidified into static trench lines in late 1914, individual German officers and NCOs with personal hunting rifles, many of them Förster, the hereditary foresters of the German countryside, men who had spent their lives behind a glass at deer and boar, recognized that the static nature of the fighting gave a patient marksman with a scoped rifle an extraordinary opportunity. In the spring of 1915, the German military formalized this. 15,000 Gewehr 98 rifles were selected at the factories for exceptional accuracy and designated for conversion to sniping configuration. The modified rifle was designated the Scharfschützen Gewehr 98. The straight bolt handle was bent downward to clear the mounted scope. A recess was cut into the stock. The scopes, primarily 4-power, Goertz and Zeiss instruments, offset to the left of the receiver to allow loading from stripper clips fitted with a bullet drop compensator drum graduated to 1,000 meters, were permanently attached. One reserve infantryman with Infantry Regiment 236 wrote of his assignment to a sniper post in April 1916 with a mixture of satisfaction that reads as entirely matter-of-fact. I am now a sniper and do a lot of observing work. Whenever I feel like it, I walk to the observing post where there is a so-called scissor telescope, through which I can observe everything that is going on the English side. When I spot an Englishman who is bold enough to raise his nose, it is my duty and obligation to shoot him. By the time the Marines arrived, these men had been at their work for 3 years. Their hides were established, their ranges were known, their targets were routine. The Marines entered this world in stages in the Toulon sector near Verdun. The 4th Marine Brigade, comprising the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments and the 6th Machine Gun Battalion, moved into French trench lines in the Verdun subsector beginning the night of 16th to 17th March 1918. This was not Verdun in the sense of the terrible attritional battles of 1916, when French and German losses had together approached 600,000 men. By early 1918, the sector had been quiet long enough that Marines who were not on the line could visit the shell-broken city itself, walking streets that had been contested at horrific cost 2 years earlier. Quiet did not mean safe. On the Western Front, quiet sectors still accumulated daily casualties through sniper fire, artillery strikes, poison gas, and the random violence of a front that was never fully still. The British, in the first 6 months of 1916 before the Somme, without a major battle, had suffered 107,776 casualties in nominally quiet sectors. The Americans in the Toulon lines would learn the same lesson. A sector can be quiet and still kill men, and the men who killed them in daylight hours were usually behind a scope. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Darby, attached to the 2nd Division as its sanitary officer, described the impact of trench life on the Marines with clinical clarity. Continuous living in the mud with never a sight of the enemy got on their nerves and made them morose. The Marines were hunters by temperament and training. They wanted to see the man they were shooting. The trench gave them only the crack of a distant rifle and a man who crumpled without warning. The German snipers in the sector worked the periscopes and parapet gaps with systematic precision. Movement above the trench line during daylight was discouraged by French veterans who had learned in the hardest possible way. A man who lifted his head without thinking or who leaned too long at the same loophole might not die immediately. He might fall forward into the trench with a wound that would take hours to kill him, or he might die so quickly that the men beside him barely had time to pull him down. The Marines rotated battalion by battalion through the front lines. Each rotation was a school. They learned about wire, gas, the mechanics of the trench system, the timing of German artillery fire, and the location of German observation positions. They learned to use periscopes rather than their own eyes to observe no man's land. They learned that the man with the scope on the other side of no man's land was not an abstraction, but a craftsman who had been practicing his craft since 1914. Among the things the Marines brought to France that the German snipers did not expect was an absolute institutional devotion to the aimed shot. The Corps had not produced specialised sniper training in the institutional sense. No dedicated school in France, until after the fighting at Verdun, had already shaped the Marines' understanding of what the rifle could do in a trench environment. but the baseline marksmanship standard of the individual Marine was exceptional by the standards of any other nation's infantry in 1917 and 1918. Harley's manual had been the standard for over a decade. Qualification with the M1903 was mandatory. The Corps competed at the national level and measured its institutional worth partly by how well its men could shoot. Hesketh Pritchard's school was the product of bitter experience. The British had been systematically outshot by German snipers for the first year and a half of the war, before developing countermeasures and a systematic training program. His school taught observation, stalking, camouflage, the construction of hides, the use of dummy heads to draw sniper fire and locate the shooter, and the technical skills of the optic. Range estimation, wind reading, holdover. It was an institution that did not exist before the war and would not have been necessary in a different kind of war. The Americans who went through the British school came back to their units with a structured understanding of the craft that supplemented what hunting and competitive shooting had given them. They brought back the papier-mâché dummy heads used to draw sniper fire. They brought back the principle of the fixed rifle, a weapon cradled in a precise position aimed at a likely crossing point, fired at night when an enemy who believed himself invisible felt safe to move. They brought back the counter-sniping methodology: shoot, relocate, do not fire twice from the same position. The United States Marine Corps maintained 2 men designated as snipers in each rifle company. Each carried a technical corporal rank designation, the additional pay reflecting the additional skill. At the company level, this meant the sniping capacity of the Marine infantry was built into the unit rather than held separately in a dedicated platoon, a different model than the Army's battalion-level sniper platoon, which was attached to the intelligence section and contained 3 to 5 two-man teams. Both systems had advantages and drawbacks. The company-level Marine sniper was closer to the tactical situation, integrated with the men he was supporting, familiar with the ground his company occupied. The Army's battalion platoon had more formal organisation, clearer tasking, and direct access to intelligence products. In the event, both models produced men who did the same work: killing at distance, locating machine guns, suppressing observation, and denying movement to an enemy who had believed himself safe at ranges that infantry rifles could not engage accurately. The mechanics within Marine companies who held the sniper designation were not the only marksmen available to unit commanders. The Corps' training standard meant that virtually any Marine who had qualified as expert or sharpshooter could be directed to snipe when the tactical situation required it. In open warfare, the fluid offensive operations that dominated the second half of 1918, this flexibility became a practical necessity. Formal sniper teams operated alongside infantrymen who simply picked up their rifles and began engaging targets because they could. Private Al Barker and his teammate Private Jack Neeland, both with the 5th Marine Regiment, demonstrated what this meant in practice during the fighting around Belleau Wood. Barker later described how they identified a sequence of German machine gun crews preparing positions in the wood line ahead of the Marine lines. Barker climbed a tall tree as close as he could get to the German positions. From that elevation, he and Neeland could see the gun crews at work. They had their M1903 Springfields and plenty of ammunition. They began to shoot. 4 machine gun crews were taken out with precision rifle fire before German counter-snipers located their position and engaged. When the German fire found Barker in the tree and knocked him out of it, Neeland carried him back despite being hit 3 times. Both were awarded Silver Stars. The first days of June 1918 transformed the character of the war for the 4th Marine Brigade. Germany's 3rd major offensive of 1918, the Aisne offensive, had struck the French lines along the Chemin des Dames on May 27th with a force that collapsed the defending divisions and pushed German infantry 40 miles in 2 days. By the last day of May, German forces were advancing down the Marne Valley toward Paris. The pace of their advance had alarmed Allied command to a degree not seen since 1914. The 2nd Division, including the 4th Marine Brigade, was ordered by emergency transport to the Château-Thierry sector. The Marines travelled by truck and on foot for over 36 hours, arriving filthy and without rest in the villages north of the Marne on the morning of June 2nd. French troops were moving in the opposite direction, retreating, haggard, some of them calling out to the Americans to turn around and follow them, that the war was over. Brigadier General James Harbord, commanding the Marine Brigade, countermanded French orders to dig new defensive lines further to the rear and ordered his Marines to hold in place. The position the Marines occupied ran across a landscape of wheat fields, patches of woodland, and scattered farms. The village of Lucy-le-Bocage anchored one end of the line. Beyond the wheat, to the northeast, lay Belleau Wood, an ancient hunting preserve of approximately 1 square kilometre, all rocky outcroppings, tangled undergrowth, and trees. The Germans had held it for 4 days and spent those days turning it into a defensive network of machine gun nests, log emplacements, and sniper positions. Lieutenant Lemuel Shepard, a junior officer with the 5th Marines, understood immediately the value of elevated observation. Before the German infantry reached rifle range, Shepard positioned several Marine snipers atop a haystack at Les Mars Farm, a farm dead along the line's eastern flank. The elevation gave them a sight line over the wheat fields that the prone riflemen in their shallow fighting positions lacked. When the German infantry began to advance across the fields on June 4th, the men on the haystack were the first to see them coming. German artillery observers in observation balloons had already identified most of the Marine defensive positions and directed fire onto them throughout the day. The fire drove off some of the supporting French artillery. Veteran German infantry advanced with bayonets fixed through the grain. The Marines waited. When the leading German waves had closed to 100 yards, the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines opened fire from their prone positions and the haystacks, and every covered position along the line. The shooting was individual and aimed. The concentrated rifle fire struck the German waves and stopped them. The German infantry pulled back into the wood. This was not sniping in the formal sense, it was the entire Marine doctrine of aimed rifle fire, every man a rifleman, compressed into a defensive engagement. The German infantry had not encountered American Marines before. They would write about them afterward. The battle for Belleau Wood lasted 26 days, beginning June 6th and ending June 26th, 1918. It consumed the entire 4th Marine Brigade in successive attacks against a position the German military command classified as well defended by experienced divisions. The German 197th and 237th Divisions occupied the wood and surrounding villages. Their machine guns were sighted to cover every approach. Their snipers were established. The Marines' first assault on June 6th began at 3:45 and produced the highest single-day casualty total in Marine Corps history to that point. 31 officers and 1,056 enlisted men became casualties. Major Benjamin Berry was wounded in the forearm during the advance across the wheat fields. Major Burton Sibley's 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines, swept into the southern end of the wood and met machine gun fire, wire and sharpshooters positioned in the rocks above them. Hand-to-hand fighting started within minutes of entry. Colonel Albertus Catlin, commanding the 6th Marines, had described the landscape of that battle in terms that made clear what his men faced. Mustard gas from German artillery, Maxim machine guns in prepared positions, and enemy snipers scanning the wood line for targets. The wood itself amplified the danger. German snipers positioned in the trees and behind rock formations could observe the Marine lines while remaining invisible. The broken terrain and thick undergrowth broke sight lines. The geometry of the wood created corridors where a Marine moving at a crouch was visible from the flanks to a man who knew exactly where to look. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels cited Cook alongside 3 other Marine snipers for their actions in and around Belleau Wood. Private Edward Severance of the 5th Marines performed what the citation described as valiant services as a sniper under constant fire. Private Earl Hoyt displayed distinguished bravery as a sniper, inflicting severe damage to the enemy. Corporal Adolf Weinberger, in one of the war's most direct engagements between individual marksmen, killed an enemy sniper in a rifle duel. The Germans had been doing this for 3 years, the Marines had been doing it for 3 months. The score was not lopsided. Private Clyde Brandon, serving as a battalion scout with the 6th Marine Regiment, received the Navy Cross and the French Croix de Guerre for a pattern of action the citation described as repeatedly volunteering for hazardous reconnaissance, penetrating enemy-held ground without hesitation, and employing his stalking skills in support of his battalion's intelligence requirements. Brandon was not a named sniper in a formal sense. He was a scout who carried a rifle and understood how to use it. and the distinction between scout and sniper in 1918 was often one of circumstance rather than designation. The Marine Rifle Company's 2 designated snipers operated at the tactical level of the company, paired as a team, one shooting, one observing and spotting, moving with the company, providing the precision fire that could suppress a machine gun crew at distances that precluded a frontal assault. The company snipers were supplemented in practice by any Marine in the unit who was proficient enough to be directed to a specific task. The technical corporal designation existed in part because the Corps needed to acknowledge this skill formally, and in part because the skill was distributed enough throughout the force that a formal separate rank structure for snipers would have been administratively unwieldy. At Belleau Wood, the sniping was not confined to the formal channels, it was happening across the engagement at every level, in every phase. Marines took position in trees, in the rocks, in collapsed German gun emplacements, and behind the same boulders German snipers had used, shooting at German infantry who exposed themselves in the clearings, at German machine gunners who paused between bursts, at the helmets that appeared in gaps in German fieldworks. By the time the last German garrison in Belleau Wood surrendered on June 26th, the 4th Marine Brigade had suffered 9,063 casualties. That number included 1,062 killed in action and 7,253 wounded. The brigade had held and then systematically reduced a position held by multiple German divisions in 31 days of continuous fighting. The French army formally renamed the wood. Belleau Wood became Bois de la Brigade de Marine, the wood of the Marine Brigade. The French awarded the Croix de Guerre to the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments, the 6th Machine Gun Battalion, and the Army's 2nd Engineers. German intelligence had its own assessment. An official German intelligence report circulated to German commanders in France described the Marines as vigorous, self-confident, and remarkable marksmen. General Pershing, visiting the 2nd Division, said what became the most quoted summation of his view of the men he had sent to France. The deadliest weapon in the world is a United States Marine and his rifle. The fighting that followed Belleau Wood did not give the Marines a respite, it gave them harder ground. On July 18, 1918, the 4th Marine Brigade was among the Allied forces committed to the Aisne-Marne counteroffensive near Soissons, a massive push intended to collapse the German salient created by the spring offensives. The Marines were marched secretly at night through rain and mud, arriving at their attack positions exhausted and without adequate maps. The assault was launched into open ground across the ravines and plateaus west of Soissons. In this phase of open warfare, the formal role of the sniper changed, but did not diminish. The machine gun positions that had been integrated into German defensive lines since 1914 now appeared in field configurations, farmhouses, hedge lines, reverse slopes, and they were the primary obstacle to the infantry advance. The men who could locate these positions and suppress their crews were critical to keeping the advance moving. German machine gun teams in well-sighted positions could hold a field approach indefinitely against infantry unsupported by armour or artillery. A sniper who could place a round through the aperture of a gun shield or who could identify and kill the gunner's assistant feeding belts from a position exposed above the rim of a crater broke the equation. The advance could continue. The next position waited. The Marines took significant casualties at Soissons. The 4 attacking Marine battalions lost more than 50% of their front-line strength. The brigade was relieved that night and moved to reserve. It had advanced the Allied line and secured terrain that the German High Command recognised as strategically critical. In the weeks following Soissons, the German army began planning the retreats that would eventually bring it to the Armistice. In September, the 4th Marine Brigade participated in the Saint-Mihiel offensive, the first large-scale American-led operation of the war. The Saint-Mihiel salient, a German-held bulge in the French lines east of Verdun, had been in place since 1914. General Pershing committed 14 American and 4 French divisions to its reduction on September 12th. The 2nd Division, with the Marine Brigade, was one of them. Corporal John Henry Pruitt of the 78th Company 6th Marine Regiment was with the brigade through this action. On September 15th at Thiaucourt, France, he was cited for distinguished and exceptional gallantry by General Pershing personally. On October 3rd, 1918, the 4th Marine Brigade was engaged at Blanc Mont Ridge in the Champagne sector near Reims. The battle had begun on October 2nd as part of the broader Allied offensive in the Champagne region, with the 2nd Division assigned to break through a German defensive position that French forces had been unable to reduce. Blanc Mont was a prominent chalk ridge with observation over the surrounding plain, and the Germans had fortified it over 4 years into a layered defensive network of machine gun emplacements, concrete bunkers, and interconnected trench systems. Corporal John Henry Pruitt was sniping the enemy when 2 German machine guns opened fire and stopped his company's advance. His Medal of Honor citation he would receive 2, one from the Army and one from the Navy, describes what followed in the spare language of official military records. Pruitt single-handedly attacked 2 machine guns, capturing them and killing 2 of the enemy. He then captured 40 prisoners in a dugout nearby. The citation notes the action took place on October 3rd. It notes that Pruitt was killed soon afterward by shellfire while he was sniping at the enemy. Both versions of the citation carry the same final clause. Army: this gallant soldier was killed soon afterward by shellfire while he was sniping at the enemy. Navy: this gallant soldier was killed soon afterward by shellfire while he was sniping the enemy. The passive construction of each version carries the weight of what the document does not expand upon. He attacked the guns, he took the prisoners, he returned to his rifle, he was still killing when the shell arrived. October 4th, 1918 was Corporal Pruitt's 22nd birthday. The last letter his family received from him had been brief, addressed to his sister Elizabeth. He wrote that his unit was taking part in a large battle and that he had not had a blanket for 6 nights. News of his death did not reach his mother in Phoenix until December 20th. General Pershing placed Pruitt on his list of 100 heroes of the American Expeditionary Forces. The Navy Department assigned his name to a destroyer, USS Pruitt DD-347, launched August 2nd, 1920 and christened by his mother. He was buried first in the Meuse-Argonne cemetery at Romagna, France, and returned to Arlington National Cemetery on October 13, 1921. He is one of 19 men in American military history to receive 2 Medals of Honor. The same day, Pruitt died at Blanc Mont in a different sector. A private first class named Andrew Kniebel was blinded. Kniebel had been born in 1897 and had enlisted in the Marine Corps. He had been fighting for 10 months, which by the standards of the 1918 AEF was a long time for a man to remain uninjured. On October 4th, 1918, the same day Pruitt died, though in a different location, a German sniper's bullet entered Kniebel's left eye and passed through the right. A photograph taken in a Paris studio in late 1918 shows Kniebel seated in a wheelchair, accompanied by a French nurse who had wheeled him from a nearby hospital for the sitting. The wet marks of the wheelchair on the studio floor are visible in the image. Kniebel survived. He lived until 1968. The photograph survives in a private collection. A Detroit newspaper published an account of his story in 1919. The account is brief because the story is brief. A Marine, 10 months of service, 1 bullet, permanent blindness. A photograph taken in the city he had come to liberate. His is not a story of documented heroism in the citation sense. He did not take machine guns or capture prisoners. He was shot through both eyes by a man he never saw, lying somewhere in a position he had built over 3 or more years, looking through a glass that carried the quality markings of Zeiss or Goertz or Hensoldt, and he pulled the trigger on someone who happened to be where the German scope settled. This is what trench sniping was. The German snipers who faced the Marines in 1918 were not improvising. By the time the 4th Brigade arrived at Verdun in March 1918, the German sniper program had been a formalized military institution for 3 years. The Scharfschützen of the Abschusskommandos had killed tens of thousands of Allied soldiers across the British, French and Belgian sectors of the Western Front. Their methods were studied and documented in German regimental manuals that described the optimal conditions for shooting, dawn and dusk, when light conditions favoured the shooter in the hide over the man in the open, and the organisational doctrine for operating the kill teams within regimental sectors. The German scope program had drawn on the industrial capacity of a country that had led the world in precision optics for a generation. Zeiss, founded in Jena in 1846, had been producing scientific and military optics of the highest quality for decades before the war. Goers in Berlin, Hensoldt in Wetzlar, Voigtlander in Braunschweig. These companies supplied equipment to observatories, to navies, to civilian hunters across Europe and North America. When the German army placed wartime contracts for rifle scopes, it was not asking for a new industrial capability, it was redirecting an existing one. The Scharfschützengewehr 98 was not a target rifle pressed into combat service. It was a specifically modified service weapon. The bolt handle modification, the stock recess, the offset mount, the BDC elevation drum, each element addressed a specific problem in field use. The elevation drum was graduated to 1,000 meters. A German sniper who had calibrated his rifle at a known distance had a mechanical solution for range that required only that he correctly identify what he was looking at and how far away it was. The Allied response to German sniping was partly technical, partly organisational, and partly human. The German snipers who had dominated the front in 1915 and 1916 had, in many cases, been killed or wounded themselves by 1918. Counter-sniping worked. A German sniper who fired from the same position twice was a German sniper who could be found and killed. The discipline of never firing twice from the same location, relocating after every shot, was not merely doctrine in 1918, it was survival arithmetic. The psychological landscape of sniping in the Great War has no precise equivalent in any other form of combat. The infantryman in the assault experienced fear as a surge of physical sensation compressed into the seconds of the charge. The whistle, the parapet, the machine gun fire, the wire, the shell crater, the enemy trench. Whatever he felt, it arrived fast and ended one way or another quickly. The sniper's experience was its inverse. The tension arrived early and stayed. Corporal Adolf Weinberger's rifle duel at Belleau Wood, for which he received his Navy Cross citation, was the compressed version of this. Two men with scopes, each of whom knew the other existed, each of whom was trying to find the other before being found. One of them succeeded. The citation records the outcome. The citation does not record the duration, the precise distance, the number of shots fired, or what Weinberger felt when it was done. This was the texture of American sniping in France in 1918. Individual men of documented but not always specifically named skill, operating in the margins of unit operations, killing at distances that conventional infantry fire could not reach, rarely appearing in official records unless they did something dramatic enough to generate a citation. The citations that survive represent a sample of what was actually done. The diversity of the men who served as snipers and designated marksmen in the AEF in 1918 does not fit any single profile. Army Commissioner of Indian Affairs Cato Sells testified to Congress about the role of Native American soldiers in the American Expeditionary Forces, noting that captured German officers, when interrogated, asked not about Allied unit strengths or future plans, but specifically about how many Indians were opposing them. Sells described the American Indian as a born sharpshooter, a scout by intuition, and an instinctive artist in the intricacies of camouflage. Private Ewing Peters, a Klamath tribesman serving as a sniper, described his first engagement with a clarity that the reporters who recorded his words found remarkable. "I felt as though I were hunting deer, only the German was the devil." He killed 2 men on that first mission using skills he had developed before the war, on ground entirely different from France, with a rifle he had learned to use before anyone told him it was a military weapon. Silas Samuels, a Choctaw from Oklahoma serving with the 312th Infantry Regiment, described a night engagement to a Literary Digest journalist, whose account described Samuel's eyes dancing as he spoke of it. This Jerry was peeping over a trench one night when Samuels was exploring around in a shell hole. Years of hunting deer at night gave the Indian a skill with the rifle that can be obtained in no other way, and the German went west on 1 bullet. These accounts are Army, not Marine, but they document the common characteristic of the American marksman in France. A foundational competence with the rifle derived from pre-military experience, adapted by training and deployed in a context that rewarded exactly what the individual had spent years developing before the war made it military. The open warfare phase that dominated the last months of the war, from August through November 1918, changed the tactical environment for snipers without changing the fundamental demand for precision shooting. Germany's fortified positions along the Western Front had been constructed and improved since 1914. Strong points featured concrete and steel bunkers, integrated machine gun positions with fields of fire designed to cover each other's approaches, and wire obstacles oriented to channel attacking infantry into predetermined kill zones. Cracking these positions by infantry assault alone required either overwhelming firepower from artillery, which was often unavailable in sufficient quantity during fast-moving advances, or the ability to locate and neutralize the machine guns by other means. Private Lawrence Calder of the 118th Infantry Regiment crawled 50 yards in advance of his platoon under both artillery and machine gun fire to suppress a German gun crew that had pinned down his unit. His partner was killed beside him. Calder continued until tanks arrived. He received the Distinguished Service Cross. Sergeant Victor C. Graves of Kansas led a patrol against multiple machine gun positions that had been producing casualties in his battalion. He captured one gun. He advanced alone toward a second. He was mortally wounded. He received a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross. These were army men, but the operational pattern they represent, a single soldier or small team operating forward of the main line, using precision rifle fire to neutralize positions that mass assault could not touch, was the same pattern the Marine snipers at Belleau Wood and Blanc Mont had demonstrated. The weapon was the M1903 Springfield. The scope, depending on the unit, was either the Winchester A5 or the Warner and Swayze. The skill was the same. On October 7, 1918, 4 days after Pruitt's action at Blanc Mont, Private First Class John Lewis Barclay of the Army's 3rd Division performed an action that has no exact parallel in documented American military history from the Great War. Barclay was a sniper scouting ahead of his unit in the Meuse-Argonne sector when he observed between 500 and 600 German soldiers massing in an open field for an attack. He was alone, his M1903. Springfield was on his back. Near his position was a knocked-out French tank. Near the tank was an abandoned German Maxim machine gun and a pile of ammunition belts. He set down his rifle. He manhandled the Maxim into the tank. He retrieved 4,000 rounds of belted ammunition. He loaded the gun. He pushed the muzzle through a tank hatch. He fired. He was still firing when a German 77mm shell struck the tank and knocked him unconscious. He regained consciousness in time to engage a second wave of German infantry. When the second wave broke and retreated, the engagement was over. Barclay had, alone, fought off what his citation described as a battalion-sized enemy attack. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. Barclay had chosen correctly between a sniper rifle and a machine gun. The situation warranted the machine gun. The sniper had assessed his target, evaluated his available weapons, and made a tactical decision. This is not the work of a man following a script. It is the work of someone whose training had taught him to solve problems with the tools available. The Marine Brigade's final major action was the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest military operation in American history at that point, involving over 1 million American soldiers and Marines along a 40-mile front between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. The 2nd Division, with the 4th Marine Brigade, crossed the Meuse River against German positions in early November 1918. The Meuse-Argonne had already produced some of the most documented individual sniper actions of the war in Army units operating across the front. Sergeant Harry Clark, from Cumberland, Maryland, spent 2 days alone in a forward sniper's post, killed 12 enemy scouts according to his DSC citation, and then took command of his company when all its officers became casualties, steadying his men, as the citation notes, by the example of his own calm. 2nd Lieutenant Blake Leitner, who had been a sergeant sniper when his action occurred on September 6 in the 110th Infantry sector, had led a daylight patrol to a trench containing enemy infantry, shifted his snipers to enfilade the position, and personally stood erect in the open while directing fire and engaging targets as the German soldiers attempted to withdraw. The citation records that he coolly stood erect and picked off the enemy as they endeavoured to retreat. Stood erect, in the open, at a trench full of German soldiers. The citation treats this as fact rather than dramatization because it was a fact, witnessed and reported through the chain of command. It is the kind of fact that the documentation of the Great War produces with some regularity, and that resists the categories of dramatic arc. The man stood up. He shot. He was awarded a medal. The citation does not explain his state of mind because the men writing citations were not in the business of explaining states of mind. The fighting on the Western Front ended at 11 o'clock on November 11th, 1918, by Armistice. The guns stopped. The silence was, by multiple accounts, as difficult to process as the noise had been. The Marines who had distinguished themselves specifically as snipers, Cook, Brandon, Barker, Neeland, Severance, Hoyt, Weinberger, and others whose names did not generate citations, returned to a country that did not yet have a formal framework for understanding what they had done. The AEF's use of snipers had been improvised on a foundation of competence shaped by British instruction, and applied with a flexibility that the institutional Army and Marine Corps had not fully anticipated and would not fully codify. Within a year of the armistice, sniper schools closed, sniper platoons were disbanded, the rifles were inventoried and stored. The Winchester A5 scopes that had gone to France with the 5th Marines were returned to stock, some of them retained in Marine Corps inventory because the Corps, unlike the Army, kept its scoped rifles rather than disposing of them. Those particular rifles would reappear 23 years later in the hands of Marine raiders on Guadalcanal, still accurate, still capable. The Army's institutional memory of what its snipers had done proved more fragile. The history of sniping in the Great War was allowed to become a footnote within a decade. The men who had written DSC citations ascribing soldiers crawling 50 yards under machine gun fire to suppress a gun crew, or standing erect in an open field to direct precision rifle fire into a German trench, did not build a curriculum around those citations. The schools that had trained thousands of snipers in 1917 and 1918 did not produce doctrinal manuals that survived the armistice with any institutional weight. The rifles were accurate, the men who used them were skilled, the lessons were filed and forgotten. The mythology that formed around Belleau Wood in the years after 1918 was not false, but it was selective. The phrase devil dogs, Teufelshunden in German, entered popular circulation as an attribution to German soldiers, who supposedly called the Marines by that name during the Belleau Wood fighting. The attribution has never been conclusively verified in German military records. What the German records do contain is the official intelligence assessment. Vigorous, self-confident and remarkable marksman. The word marksman is not metaphorical. It is a tactical assessment made by officers whose units had faced Marine rifle fire. The mythology settled on the charge, the assault, the moment of physical contact, Dan Daly's improvised battle cry before one of the Marine attacks, the hand-to-hand fighting in the wood's rocky interior, the bayonet work in the German trenches. These are real events that are genuinely documented. They are also the events that photograph well in memory, that translate readily into recruitment posters and regimental narratives. The sniping was, in a precise sense, more lethal than it appeared. The charges at Belleau Wood killed Marines in the hundreds in a single day. The sniping killed Germans over weeks in ones and twos, from positions that had been built carefully and occupied patiently. The charges were terrifying and memorable. The sniping was deliberate and almost invisible, which is exactly the quality that made it effective. The Marine Corps returned from France with something it would not fully recognise the value of for another generation. The institutional tradition of marksmanship, the mandatory qualification, the national matches, the technical corporal designation, the culture of the expert rifleman, had produced men who adapted easily to the most demanding form of precision shooting in existence at the time. They had done it without a dedicated sniper corps, without a formal sniper school in the pre-war period, and without a weapon system that had been designed from the ground up for sniping. The Winchester A5 was a competitive match scope. The M1903 Springfield was a service rifle selected for accuracy, because accuracy was a Marine value before it was a tactical requirement. This combination edged a culture of marksmanship embedded in individual training, a rifle accurate enough for competition and a scope designed for 1,000-yard target work, had produced Navy Cross recipients and Distinguished Service Cross recipients, and a Medal of Honor winner who died sniping on the same day he took 2 machine guns single-handed and captured 40 prisoners. The lesson the Marine Corps drew from this experience was the one it already held. every Marine is a rifleman. The practical implication for future conflicts would be demonstrated in the Pacific Theatre, where the same A5-equipped M1903 Springfields that had gone to France in 1917 were still in Marine Corps inventory in 1942, still being issued to Marines on Guadalcanal because the Corps had kept its sniper rifles while the Army had disposed of its institutional memory. Corporal John Henry Pruitt is buried in Section 18 of Arlington National Cemetery. The citation text appears on two documents, one from the Army and one from the Navy, issued posthumously on May 10, 1919. Both say the same thing in slightly different language. The facts are not in dispute. He attacked 2 machine guns alone and captured them. He captured 40 prisoners. He returned to his rifle. He was killed by German shellfire while he was shooting. He died on his birthday. His mother received news of this on December 20th. In December 1919, she received a telegram from the Secretary of the Navy asking if she would christen a destroyer being built in his name. She agreed. The USS Pruitt was launched August 2nd, 1920. Private First Class Andrew Kniebel, blinded in both eyes by a German sniper's bullet on October 4th, 1918, returned to the United States and lived until 1968. He was 50 years old at the Armistice's 50th anniversary. He had been 19 years old when the bullet arrived. Private Walter Cook, 5th Marine Regiment, went from private to gunnery sergeant in a single engagement at Belleau Wood, through the mechanism of sequential officer casualties and the demonstrated ability to lead men when no officer remained to do so. His decoration record, Navy Cross, Army DSC Croix de Guerre with 3 palms, 2 silver stars, is among the most extensive of any enlisted Marine in the Great War. Privates Al Barker and Jack Neeland, 5th Marines, who climbed trees to kill machine gun crews and were knocked from those trees by German counter-snipers, both survived. Both received silver stars. Corporal Adolf Weinberger won a rifle duel at Belleau Wood against a German sniper. He survived. Private Clyde Brandon, 6th Marines, penetrated enemy lines repeatedly as a battalion scout sniper and received the Navy Cross and the French Croix de Guerre. Major H.V. Hesketh Pritchard of the British First Army Sniping School published a book about sniping in the Great War after the Armistice. He described Americans as especially right material. He was not wrong. General Philippe Pétain, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army, noted the Americans' particular aptitude for sniping. He noted they easily excelled in the role. This was not a compliment he offered lightly. He had commanded the defence of Verdun. General Pershing put 100 men on his list of heroes of the AEF. Pruitt was one of them. The list is not organised by branch or weapon. It simply records that in the wars last year, men did things that other men in the same positions did not do, and that the doing of those things mattered to the outcome. The men who opposed them were Paris Island graduates who had qualified on the M1903 Springfield before they knew France existed. They were hunters from Tennessee and Oklahoma and Montana who had been shooting game since they were children and found that the same skills transferred without significant modification to a different kind of target in a different kind of field. They were competitive shooters who had placed in the national matches and whose familiarity with precision optics dated to the years before the Winchester Arms Company sold its A5 design to Lyman. They were mechanics elevated to technical corporal with a pay bump and the authority of a scope. They were scouts who carried rifles as a natural extension of their operational role. They were company-grade officers like Lieutenant Lemuel Shepard, who positioned their men to see the fight before the fight arrived. And they were men like Corporal John Henry Pruitt of the 78th Company, 6th Marine Regiment, who on the day before his 22nd birthday took 2 machine guns alone, captured 40 prisoners, and then picked up his rifle again and continued shooting until a German artillery shell made him stop. He is buried at Arlington. The destroyer named for him was decommissioned in 1945. The wood where the Marines fought in June 1918 still carries the name the French gave it in their honour. The sniping that happened in that wood, and at Blanc, Mont, and in the chalk trenches near Verdun, and in the grain fields outside Château-Thierry, and at every position the 4th Marine Brigade occupied between March and November 1918, was not the story that became famous. It was the story that happened regardless.